Hi, beautiful people. Welcome to the Fort Salem Library, where we read you your fanfiction. So sit down or don't, relax or don't, and enjoy these stories in a way you have not before. We at Fort Salem Library do not own Motherland Fort Salem or any of the related characters. The Motherland Fort Salem series is created by Elliot Lawrence and owned by Freeform. This story is a work of fanfiction and is meant for entertainment only. We are not making any profit from these stories. All rights of the original Motherland Fort Salem story belong to Freeform. We also do not own All That Remains or any of its original characters and storylines. We did, however, get permission from the author to read their story. This story was created and written by TrueFreak89, and you can find a link in our show notes. This story is being read to you by Angela.
All That Remains, Chapter 2. After getting their packs and scourges from their dorm, the unit made their way above ground using a freight elevator to the surface. It was big enough to carry a truck and felt empty with only 3 of them in it. Rial winced as they reached the surface and the doors opened, flooding the elevator carriage with sunlight. She hadn't been out in days, maybe even a week. It was hard to keep track of time when you were underground. The rest of the group were gathered by the truck, including Grace and Anacostia. The truck was military, armor-plated, with steel mesh at all the windows and a gun turret on top. The gun was a recent addition. They allowed civilians to help them out in the field. Along with Graves and Anacostia, there was a male witch, whose job it was to drive the truck, and 2 civilians, 1 man and 1 woman. Rial didn't recognize either of them. They must have come in with the last batch of survivors the month before. Anacostia caught sight of them and waved the bellwether unit over. "Well, if it isn't my favorite scry," she nodded at Tally, unusually chipper. Anacostia Quartermain always seemed to be in a good mood whenever they were out of the base and standing above ground. Abigail scoffed, folding her arms over her chest. "Don't worry, Lieutenant, we won't hold it against you for playing favorites." "I won't. I know I'm her favorite," Riel grinned, hefting her pack onto her other shoulder. "Well, look at that! Caller made a joke. Must be Christmas already," said Abigail. Anacostia rolled her eyes at all of them. "I don't play favorites. I hate all of you equally. So get in the damn truck. Let's hustle." She clapped her hands, rounding them all up. Tally took her place up front with Anacostia and the driver, while everyone else piled in the back. The female civilian took her place in the gunner's nest up top, ready for any freakers they might encounter. The guards on watch switched off the power to the front gate to let them pass. An electric chain link fence protected the entire perimeter of the mountain bunker, with sentry towers posted every few hundred feet and guards on watch for stray freakers and hordes. The military held a scorched earth policy around the base that reduced everything within a mile of the mountain to ash, buildings and trees alike. Freakers nested in dark places during the day, and burning everything down kept them from nesting too close to the base. A handful of freakers could quickly attract more of their kind and eventually from a horde. Nobody in their right mind wanted a horde on their doorstep. Riel and Abigail sat at the back of the truck, watching their 6 while Tally used her clairvoyance to look out for any dangers up ahead. As their necro, Grace projected an aura that kept any freakers they encountered on the road from taking an interest in them. Faced with nothing but empty road, Riel found her mind wandering, thinking about all the people they'd lost. Her mom died long before the infection. Her dad had been back home in the session when it hit. There was no way to know for sure if he was alive or dead. But Riel knew the odds. She wasn't going to hold her breath on a reunion. Tally's mom was dead too. The matrifocal compound Tally came from was overrun by the infected early on. The news took its time to reach her at Fort Salem because of all the chaos. But at least Tally knew for sure what became of her mother. Riel didn't have the same luxury when it came to her dad. Abigail was the only one among them with a surviving parent. General Petra Bellwether was stationed at a base outside Washington, tasked with protecting President Wade. She and Abigail kept in contact via a satellite phone, but it had been over a year since Abigail saw her mother in person. Rael's unit was her family now. They had gone from strangers she was forced to bunk with to friends who meant the world to her. She and Abigail started out at odds with each other, but now they were as close as sisters. They would still give each other shit, but at the same time, they would die for one another. Abigail almost had once, back at Fort Salem, the day the protections fell and the infested swarmed the grounds. Abigail risked her life to save Rael's when it looked like she might be left behind in the evacuation. Refusing to leave Rael behind, Abigail jumped out of a helicopter with only a rope tied around her waist and a handful of salva. She had saved 7 witches that day, Rael included. Alder presented her with a medal for gallantry, and Petra Bellwether flew in from Washington to see her receive it. It now lay long forgotten at the bottom of Abigail's footlocker. She had Rael and Tally, and that was all she needed. "What do you think we'll find?" Abigail asked, breaking Rael out of her own thoughts. "The chocolate situation is getting desperate, and I can't take any more of Glory's hooch. It's a miracle she and Tally aren't blind growing up drinking that stuff." Rael scoffed. "I've had worse in the session." Abigail pulled a face in sympathy. "Ugh, can't imagine anything worse than Glory's moonshine." Rael laughed, shaking her head as Abigail's high society snobbishness shone through. "Let's hope we get lucky. Kalida asked me for more books too. She's read all the ones in the library. I've never known a damn kid to read so much." Kalida and her brother were at Fort Salem when the infection broke out. They were Tarim, a nomadic group of witches who remained undiscovered until shortly before the outbreak. The brother and sister pair had been in Fort Salem to receive medical treatment for Kalida. She had been infected by a mysterious illness that none of the fixers at the base could heal, except Rael. She had healed the little girl, creating a powerful bond between the two of them. "Yeah," said Abigail, with an offhanded sigh. "I've tried to get her to watch cartoons or something instead. You know, normal kid stuff." Abigail and Adil, Kalia's older brother, were dating. Abigail was close with the little girl, but she gravitated more towards Rael. Rael gave a shrug. "She and Adil are most likely the last of their kind. That's a lot to weigh on a kid's shoulders. If she likes to read, then let her." "Yeah, you're right." The crackling of gunfire interrupted them from up above in the gunner's nest. Rael peered out the back of the truck and spotted 2 freakers out in a field 100 yards away from them. The civilian took them out with ease, their heads exploding from the high-caliber rounds. A single freak or 2 was no big deal. It was easy to take out a handful. Hordes were what you had to worry about. The last one that came by the base had to have been over 500 strong. It took all night for it to pass by the base, leaving more than a few dozen stragglers behind. Individual freakers tended to get distracted and break off from the larger group. The guards on morning duty had been left to mop up what was left behind. The rest of the ride passed without event. The military had done a good job of making the landscape around the base as inhospitable for the infected as possible. It was only as they came upon the town Anacostia had mapped out that they saw more freaker activity. The town looked quiet overall, but Anacostia wasn't taking any chances. She had the driver drive all around the town honking the horn, trying to draw out any stray freakers hiding in the buildings. The civilian in the gunner's nest took out any that stumbled into the street. Once Anacostia was happy they'd taken out most of the active ones, she gave the order for the driver to park up in the center of town, right outside the town hall. Rael and Anacostia climbed out of the truck with the straps of their packs slung over both shoulders and their scourges at the ready. Graves and the civilians followed suit, with Anacostia, Tally, and the driver coming around the back of the truck to join them. Anacostia handed them all a map of the city, with sections for them to search color-coded by groups. Then she split them into groups. Tally with the female civilian, the drive, Clive, with Graves and Anacostia and Abigail, which left Rael with the male civilian. "Told ya I was her favorite," Abigail gloated, sticking her tongue out at Rael. Rael flipped her off. Just her luck. Abigail got the lieutenant, and she was stuck with the civilian. Rael was on blue team, which meant she and the civilian had the supermarket to check first, along with Graves and Clive. Rael liked Clive. He was a friendly guy and handy with a scourge, a good person to have watching her back. Unlike the civilian, Max, he'd given her his name in the truck, looked jumpy, like someone who'd had one too many cups of coffee. Rael was willing to bet a month's rations that he was the cowardly type. Rael had seen enough of them, especially among civilians. That was probably why Quartermain had paired her with him. Rael could take care of herself, and Anacostia knew it. Rael was willing to give Max the benefit of the doubt, though, unlike Graves, who looked like she might punch him in the face if he interrupted her while she went over the plan. He took the hint when the older witch snapped at him to shut his mouth. Rael pulled up her combat hood while Graves told them the plan a second time for the civilians' benefit. Caller, you and Action Man over here go around back. Go in through the loading bay and sweep the warehouse. Garland and I will go in through the front and we'll meet in the middle. Got it. Rael nodded. Graves pulled her aside when she was finished. Sorry you got stuck with the civilian caller, but be careful in there, okay? Got it, Lieutenant, and don't sweat it. With a little luck, a freak might get him, Rael said, making Graves laugh. You got a dark sense of humor, caller. You're sure you're not a necro? Mama raised a fixer, ma'am. Rael grinned. She liked Graves. She was fun when she was off duty, and she was good in bed. It was a winning combination, but Rael had never felt that undeniable spark with her. She didn't want to lead the other woman on, knowing full well it wouldn't go anywhere in the long run. Once both teams were set, they went their separate ways. Rael and Max took the back of the supermarket. Climbing up onto the loading bay, they made their way inside. Rael pulled the bottom of her hood up to cover her nose and mouth. It stunk inside. Is that Freakers? Max hissed, covering his own mouth with the bandana tied around his neck. He moved with a nervous energy, his eyes darting all over the dim warehouse. Rael dropped behind him, anxious about him being behind her with a loaded rifle. No, she answered. It's spoiled food. The fridges are all off. Come on. They finished sweeping the warehouse. Clearing it, they went up front to meet with Graves and Clive. The other team had cleared the shop floor. They had hit the jackpot. The supermarket was untouched. A clear sign that the people in the town had been turned before any looting could take place. There was enough in the supermarket alone to keep the whole base fed for months. Graves used the radio strapped to her pack to contact Anacostia and let her know. Then the four of them started loading up shopping carts to take to the truck. It took most of the morning for them to empty the supermarket. The others all had the same success, and come lunchtime, the truck was over halfway full. They all were grouped there to eat together. Rael sat with her unit on a patch of grass beneath the shade of a willow tree. We've already found so much. It's enough to keep us going for months. Abigail was vibrating with excitement. Rael wasn't listening. She was too busy watching Max sneak something out of the truck. Hey, she called out. Put that back! She got to her feet to confront him, and her unit followed without her having to ask them. That food is for everyone, asshole! Abigail snapped at him, her hand hovering over the scourge. Whoa, I was just getting some of my share early is all. He put his hands up in front of him in defense. Put it back. Anacostia, overhearing the commotion, joined them at the back of the truck. You have rations, now put whatever you've got back. Okay. He pulled a handful of candy bars out of one of the pockets in his cargo pants and tossed them into an open box. He gave Rael the stink eye as she and her unit took their spot back under the willow tree. After lunch, they all split back into their teams and went back to work. Anacostia shaded her eyes with her hand as she glanced up at the sky. We've only got a few more hours. There's a storm in the distance. I want to be back at Iron Mountain before it hits. Rael and Max spent a couple of hours going through the sections marked in blue on their maps. Some buildings Rael flat out avoided if she suspected there were freakers nesting inside. They already had more than enough, and disturbing a nest wasn't worth the risk. One of the last places for them to check was a bottling plant. Rael hesitated as they entered. It smelled foul inside, like something had died. A sure sign of a nest. We should leave it, she said, but the civilian didn't listen. He stepped further inside, making a beeline for a crate of unlabeled bottles. It could be booze. We can't leave without checking it out, he hollered over his shoulder, making Rael wince. Fine, just be careful and quiet, she hissed at him, cautiously stepping further onto the factory floor herself. The words of warning had barely left her mouth when there was a loud crash. Riel's head snapped around in time to see Max with an open bottle to his lips and a crate of bottles smashed all around him. Motherfuck! A high-pitched screeching started up from somewhere deep within the bowels of the factory. It was the only warning they got, before freakers started flooding out of every door in the place. The civilian froze. His feet rooted to the spot until Riel yanked him back by the back of his jacket. She was a soldier. They trained her for this shit. Not the end of the world, per se, but she knew the difference a quick reaction could make in life or death circumstances. The civilian's survival instincts kicked in, and he ran with Riel towards the double doors. They'd only pried one open when they came in. Riel reached it first. She yelped as Max pulled on her hood, tugging her back with enough force to make her fall on the ground. She spun, falling on her face and cracking her chin off the concrete floor, as Max disappeared out the front door. Riel rolled the second she landed, putting some distance between her and the closest freakers. She performed the wind shear seed, throwing up an impact-absorbing shield that the first line of freakers bounced off. The others kept floating onto the factory floor, piling on top of each other in an attempt to reach the witch. With the front door blocked, Riel's only option was the stairs. She scrambled up them, the infected following close behind her and screeching at the top of their lungs. She ran up flight after flight, her lungs burning and her calves aching. When she reached the top floor, there was nowhere left to go. She slammed against the door to the roof and pulled on it with all her might, but it wouldn't budge. Had she had the time to think, she might have tried to break the lock with a seed, but with the freakers hot in her tail, she couldn't afford to stop moving. There was a surface elevator nearby, the metal gate standing open. Riel dived into it just as the first freakers reached the top floor. She slammed the gate shut and locked it with the sealing seed. The freakers slammed up against the cage, their arms reaching through the gaps in the metal to grab at her, while they screeched and hollered. The foul stench of so many bodies burned the back of Riel's throat as she bent over, her hands on her knees, gasping for air. After catching her breath, she tried the buttons on the panel in the corner, but nothing happened. Riel wasn't surprised at the lack of power. It hadn't been on anywhere else in town. She was stuck. Riel reached for the radio fastened to the strap of her backpack, but the screen was bust and the case all cracked. She tried the button, but nothing happened. Fuck! She cursed, kicking out at the metal crate and setting off a fresh round of screeching from the infected swarming her. She slumped to the ground in defeat. There was nowhere for her to go, and no way out with so many freakers surrounding her. Her only hope was her unit coming for her. Across town, the civilian ran up to the supply truck. The storm Anacostia had mentioned had hit, with a light rain drizzling over the group. The sky was darkened, and clouds were gathered overhead. Sounds from the bottling plant had awoken other nearby nests, and the town was flooding with freakers. "Where's Ray?" Abigail demanded. She and the civilian were the last group they'd been waiting on. Max ignored Abigail screaming at him as he scrambled into the back of the truck. He slammed his palm against the wall. "Come on, let's get moving already! What are we waiting for?" Both Abigail and Tally were screaming at him now, their expressions frantic. Anacostia stepped up into the truck, grabbing the civilian by the front of the shirt and growling in his face. "Where is Collar?" She's dead," he stammered, his eyes wide with fear and his brows covered in sweat. "We disturbed a nest. They got her, okay? She's dead. Ain't nothing we can do. We gotta move." Anacostia let him go and took a step back, looking dazed. Abigail, though, took a menacing step forward. "You're lying. Where is she? Where's Rael?" Anacostia caught hold of her and pushed her back. Abigail could feel the older woman shaking as she moved her head from side to side. "It's too dangerous to stay between the storms and the nest. We'll come back for her body. We won't leave her, Bellwether." "No." Abigail shook her head. Her lips pursed and her brow furrowed. "No! We are not leaving without her. We are—" She fell silent as Anacostia laid her hand on her, linking with Abigail and sending her to sleep with practiced ease. She shot a warning look at Tally. "Do I have to worry about you too, Craven?" Tally shook her head. "No, ma'am." She dropped to the ground, cradling Abigail's upper half in her lap and stroking her hair, while silent tears ran down her cheeks. Anacostia looked her way and banged on the side of the truck. "Let's move it!" she hollered, The rest of the scavenging party piled into the truck, and Clive put his foot down on the gas pedal. Anacostia slumped against the crate of water at the back of the truck, watching as swarmers chased after them. The gunner didn't bother wasting bullets on them. There were too many. The whole truck sat in an oppressive silence, mourning the loss of their sister witch. In the shadows of the clock tower, high above the town hall, a figure hiding in the shadows watched the truck drive off. With her hood up, she hefted a heavy backpack over her shoulder. She'd been avoiding the other group all day while trying to salvage, until the whole town had erupted into chaos, with freakers swarming everywhere. The disruption came from over by the bottling plant. She had watched the guy and the blonde girl in military uniform go in, but only the civilian came back out. It was none of her business. Her pack was full, and she already had what she needed. She could leave. She didn't owe the blonde anything, and the last thing she needed was to get mixed up with the military. Besides, the girl might already be dead. She'd be wasting her time. Cursing, she bit down on her lip. Being ripped apart by a swarm was a shitty way to go. She had seen it before. The girl looked young, no older than herself. Huffing out a sigh, she pulled her scope out of her pack. She'd taken it off a rifle she found on a corpse. She left the rifle behind. Guns weren't her thing. Bringing up the scope to her left eye, she closed the right one and looked over at the plant. Most of the freakers seemed to be on the top floor, something holding their attention. Their aggressive swarming was a good sign. It meant they hadn't caught the girl yet. She moved the scope up to the figure of what they were swarming around and spotted the metal cage of the freight elevator. The witch must have sealed herself inside the elevator. The corners of her mouth turned up into a smirk. Clever girl.
Please find the fanfiction you just listened to on Archive of Our Own and leave the author some love. Without them, this wouldn't be possible, and we want to thank them from the bottoms of our hearts for creating these amazing stories and keeping the show alive.